Lila Matthews knelt in the front pew of Grace Community Church, morning light casting golden rectangles on the polished floor. At 22, she knew every corner of this sanctuary, the muted echoes of familiar hymns, the scent of old wooden pews. Her grandmother's Bible lay open across her lap, pages worn from years of turning and prayer. Beside her, Ethan Carter sang in a clear, steady voice. They had grown up together, racing bikes in the summer heat and gathering for youth group on Wednesday nights. Lila remembered how he'd been there for every milestone: her baptism, high school graduation, even the tearful night her dog passed away. Lately, she couldn't ignore the small flutter in her chest whenever she caught him smiling at her. She felt a warmth she couldn't quite label, woven in with the comfort of home. After the final hymn, Pastor Nichols spoke about anchoring oneself in faith, especially during life's upheavals. His sermon drew on a passage from the Psalms. "Your word is a lamp to my feet and a light to my path." Lila listened, pen resting on the edge of her Bible. She sensed the familiar tug of longing and gratitude, as though God was whispering reassurance into the stillness of her heart. When the service ended, the congregation stirred. Friends and families headed for the foyer, where laughter and the smell of coffee mingled. Ethan lingered, waiting for Lila. Mrs. Jenkins from the youth choir stopped to greet them, her cheeks rosy with enthusiasm. "So glad to see you both," she said, eyes twinkling. "It's a blessing you're staying involved." Lila squeezed Ethan's arm lightly, and they made their way to the refreshment table. He poured coffee into 2 paper cups and handed one to her. "Think we'll have time to grab lunch before heading to the shelter?" he asked. She nodded, smiling. Volunteering at the local shelter had become their shared weekend routine. Together, they served warm meals, sorted donations, and listened to people's stories. That afternoon, sunlight filtered through high windows as they worked in tandem. Lila at the serving station, Ethan washing dishes. Every so often, they caught each other's glance. His presence felt like a steady anchor, grounding her in a world that sometimes felt unsteady. When the crowd thinned, a shy boy approached, clutching a tattered teddy bear. His eyes flickered nervously. Lila knelt to say hello, introducing herself as gently as she could. Ethan joined them, offering a friendly wave. Underneath the bustling noise, Lila felt a subtle warmth spread through her chest, watching Ethan's kindness in action. It was moments like these that reminded her she wasn't alone, that faith was more than ritual. It lived in compassion and service. Afterward, they loaded into Ethan's old truck. As they drove past the large oak tree on the church grounds, Lila recalled how they used to race each other to the top, fearless on its sturdy branches. Now, life was more complicated, but that memory symbolized something unwavering. She turned to Ethan, about to speak, but hesitated. A part of her wanted to share the swirl of feelings she'd been harboring, the sense that their bond was slowly deepening beyond friendship. Back at the church, Lila found her mother in the fellowship hall, discussing next week's potluck plans. Her mother's eyes lit up when she saw Lila and Ethan. "Stay for dinner," she insisted. "I made a casserole." The 3 of them settled into the church kitchen, laughter bouncing off the tile walls. Amid gentle teasing and chatter, Lila's mind wandered to the uncertainty of the coming months. She'd soon be leaving for college in the city, and although she was excited, a tinge of melancholy crept in. What if life pulled her away from this safe, familiar place? And from Ethan. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Lila and Ethan walked out to her mother's car together. The parking lot was nearly empty, the warm glow of the church lights illuminating the path. "Remember to text me if you need anything," Ethan said softly. "College is going to be amazing, but I'll miss you." His tone carried the faintest tremor, the sincerity of a childhood friend who never wanted distance to change them. "I'll miss you too," Lila replied. She fiddled with the cross necklace around her neck, unsure whether to voice the affection blossoming in her heart. Instead, she offered a soft smile. "We'll keep in touch. You can't get rid of me that easily." He laughed. and for a moment the air felt charged, as though a new horizon had opened between them. But neither spoke of it directly. They said their goodbyes, a tender understanding lingering in the silence. Lila watched him walk away, a pang of yearning tugging at her. Yet comfort and trust still outweighed the uncertainty. Later that night, she sat in her room, boxes half packed for the move. Her Bible rested on the nightstand, open to Proverbs 3. She ran her finger along the verse underlined in ink. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he shall direct your paths. The words felt personal, as though guiding her forward. Faith, she realized, was not just about Sunday mornings or daily devotions. It was also about stepping into the unknown with trust, believing that the light she carried inside would not be snuffed out by change. She picked up her phone, typed a quick text to Ethan, "I'm grateful for you, good night," and set the phone aside, heart lighter. Outside, the branches of the oak tree rustled in the night breeze, a living emblem of roots and stability. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new adventures, but she was anchored in something strong, a steady flame of belief and the warmth of someone who cared. In the quiet darkness, Lila prayed a gentle, earnest prayer for guidance. For her family, her future, and for Ethan, who had become more than just a companion in the pew. As she drifted to sleep, her last conscious thought was that faith wasn't merely an anchor keeping her from drifting. It was a promise that she could sail into new waters and still find her way back home. Lila Matthews arrived at college carrying a sense of anticipation and a well-worn Bible. The campus buzzed with energy, new students hauling suitcases, orientation leaders giving tours, and flyers shouting announcements for clubs and parties. She'd grown up in a quiet community where church potlucks were the highlight of any weekend. Now, towering buildings and endless crowds dwarfed those old touchstones. Her dorm room was cramped but bright, with a view of the city skyline. She met her roommate Zoe, an artsy whirlwind wearing black eyeliner and jangling bracelets. Within minutes, Zoe held up a neon flyer. "Rooftop party tonight. You have to come," she said, eyes gleaming. "Best way to meet people." Lila hesitated, picturing the cozy fellowship group she'd planned to visit. But she was curious. After all, hadn't she come here to experience more than her small-town life? "Okay," she agreed, slipping her cross necklace under her sweater. She told herself it was just one party. That first night expanded into a kaleidoscope of new experiences, pulsating music, cheap drinks, and an endless chain of introductions. The city lights were dazzling against the dark sky. Lila found herself sipping a beer she didn't actually enjoy, but the laughter around her seemed to dull any reservations. She felt a flutter of excitement mixed with the faint whisper of doubt. By the time she returned to the dorm, it was well past midnight. Her phone buzzed, a text from Ethan. "Miss you at Bible study." She blinked at the screen, guilt pooling in her chest. "I'll reply tomorrow," she promised, and set the phone aside. Days turned into weeks. Lila's schedule filled with classes, group projects, and spur-of-the-moment outings, karaoke nights, art shows, late runs to the nearest 24-hour diner. She discovered an edgy coffee house off campus, where she and Zoe took artsy photos for social media. The likes and comments flooded in, fueling a new sense of belonging that thrilled her even as it unsettled her. She noticed the quiet nudge in her heart, the lingering sense that she was ignoring her spiritual life, but it was simpler to push it aside. Ethan kept texting, each message gentle and supportive. Sometimes Lila tapped out a quick reply, "Doing fine. Hope all's well back home." But it felt hollow. She couldn't bring herself to talk about the parties or the hangovers, or how she almost never opened her Bible anymore. She'd glance at it on her desk, unread, and wonder how she'd drifted so easily. Zoe, meanwhile, became Lila's gateway to everything unconventional. Rooftop raves, bohemian art circles, basement poetry slams. Lila discovered a fascination with this world, yet she also felt a subtle undercurrent of loneliness. The next day in class, she'd be too tired to focus, scribbling half-hearted notes. She skirted invitations to campus Christian fellowship events, telling herself she'd go another time. Late one Saturday, Lila joined Zoe at a neon-lit club. The music vibrated through her, a rhythmic pulse that swallowed any lingering doubts. She danced, laughed, and drank too much, only to wake up the next morning, tangled in sheets, ears still ringing. The reflection in her mirror looked disheveled, and she tucked her cross necklace deeper into her sweater to hide its glimmer. It was easier not to be reminded, yet guilt persisted. A wave of it washed over her when she passed a street preacher quoting scripture on a busy corner. Another came when she noticed an incoming call from her mother, ignored because she was too ashamed to admit how she'd spent her nights. She recalled her father's words in a sermon, "Not all that glitters is grace." She scrolled through Zoe's Instagram posts, brimming with cryptic captions and half-lit selfies. Lila craved the carefree image they portrayed, but couldn't silence the ache that told her she was drifting farther from who she was. One evening, after a blur of parties and missed deadlines, Lila stumbled into her dorm to find a message from Ethan. "Haven't heard from you in a while. You okay?" She sank onto her bed, tears burning in her eyes. She wanted to open up, to say she felt lost, that she missed the warmth of Sunday mornings and the security of real friendships. But she typed only a brief response. "I'm fine. Busy with school. Talk soon." Her sleep was fitful. She dreamed of being back at Grace Community, hearing the old hymns ring through the sanctuary. She saw Ethan in the pew beside her, smiling gently. But in the dream, she turned away, the music fading into thumping bass lines of a club. She woke drenched in confusion and regret. That same night, Zoe waltzed in, exclaiming about a new group of friends, telling Lila she should come out again. Lila forced a smile, feigning enthusiasm. But inside, something felt fractured. Later, she stared at the cross necklace in her hand. "Why am I hiding this?" she asked herself. "Isn't this still part of me?" She recalled a time when she and Ethan had stayed up until dawn, reading scripture and talking about life's big questions. Back then, her faith had been an anchor, firm, steady, something she could cling to when the world felt uncertain. Now, the glitter of city life seemed to overshadow everything she once cherished. Weeks passed, her heart caught in a tug of war. She would attend campus events, but skip the Christian fellowship. She'd wander through clubs and parties, but cry quietly afterward in her dorm. Zoe teased her for feeling guilty, dismissing Lila's inner battle as needless worry. Yet Lila knew her feelings weren't mere guilt. They were the pangs of a conscience that still believed in a guiding truth she was choosing to ignore. One frigid night, after clubbing under swirls of neon light, Lila huddled in a taxi back to campus. Rain pelted the windshield. Pressing her forehead against the glass, she thought of home. The oak tree, the church potlucks, Ethan's unwavering kindness. She pulled her phone from her pocket, searching for some tether to the life she used to know. Her call log showed a series of missed calls from Ethan, from her mother. Her chest clenched. In a moment of clarity, she realized this path, with all its sparkle and excitement, was eroding the faith that had once shaped her so deeply. Yet she felt trapped in the new persona she'd cultivated, unsure how to confess her uncertainty to anyone, least of all herself. Back in her dorm, Lila slipped into bed without removing her cross. For the first time in weeks, she whispered a halting prayer. An apology, a plea, a barely formed request for guidance. It wasn't eloquent, but it was real. Outside, the city lights glowed, offering their usual enticement. Still, she closed her eyes to them, turning instead toward the flicker of hope within. Maybe tomorrow, she thought, she would find the courage to respond to Ethan properly, to acknowledge the conflict she could no longer deny. The thought offered a fragile sense of resolve, even as her restless dreams returned, carrying her through the long night and into the unknown morning to come. Night fell early in December, cloaking the city in a sharp wind and swirling flurries of snow. Lila Matthews huddled into her coat as she stepped off the bus near her college dorm. breath puffing white in the frigid air. The evening had started with a simple invitation, some classmates celebrating the end of final exams. A little champagne, a toast or two, and then she'd planned to leave. But the glittery promise of freedom had once again stretched into hours. Now her head throbbed with a faint ache, and she wished she'd stayed home with a mug of tea and her psychology notes. Halfway to her building, she froze. A lone figure leaned against the brick wall by the entrance. For a moment, she feared it might be someone looking for trouble, but then she recognized the outline of a familiar coat, the sturdy posture. Ethan! He looked up at the sound of her footsteps, exhaling a cloud of breath. Lila! Despite the cold, his voice held warmth and concern. She wasn't ready to see him, especially not tonight, not after champagne had made her world spin. Ethan! She managed, her tone sharper than intended. What are you doing here? Her words slurred slightly. She saw a flicker of worry cross his face. She immediately felt defensive, angry at herself for feeling guilty under his gaze. He held out a thermos. I brought you some tea. It's freezing out here. Then, more quietly, he added, Your mom's worried. You haven't called home in weeks. Lila's chest tightened. It wasn't that she didn't love her mother. She did, fiercely. But avoiding phone calls was easier than facing the questions about her spiritual life, her slipping grades, the new edge in her voice whenever faith came up. Her mother had asked Ethan to check in on her. Of course she had, and it stung her pride to see him here, as if she were a child needing rescue. I'm fine, she said, hugging herself against the cold. You didn't have to come all this way. She expected Ethan to argue, to lecture her for the swirling rumors, missing fellowship, skipping Sunday services, partying with people who saw her cross as just another accessory. But he only reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a familiar leather-bound volume. Her grandmother's Bible. The sight of it nearly stole her breath. She realized she'd left it at Grace Community Church the last time she'd been home, weeks ago. I found this in the back pew, Ethan explained softly. Figured you might want it. He didn't sound judgmental or angry. If anything, he sounded sad. The kind of sadness that comes when someone you love is drifting away and you can't stop it. Lila's eyes burned with sudden tears, but she forced them back, taking the Bible gingerly. She refused to meet his gaze. Are you here to scold me? She asked, the edge in her voice betraying the knot of emotion in her chest. He shook his head. I'm not here to judge you. I'm just concerned. Before she could respond, the wind picked up, sending snow flurries across their faces. She clenched her jaw, bracing against the chill. In the harsh glow of the street lamp, Ethan's breath formed fleeting white clouds. She hated how self-conscious she felt. Her mascara had likely smudged, and she was certain her breath reeked of cheap champagne. She cut her eyes away. You can't. She paused, unsure how to voice the storm inside her. He couldn't possibly understand how lost she felt, could he? But Ethan didn't press. Instead, he held out a folded note tucked inside the cover of the Bible. This is for you, he said, stepping back. I'll be around for a day or two, staying at a friend's apartment. If you want to talk, let me know. Otherwise, just read the note. She hesitated, then grabbed the note. The movement stirred fresh anger and shame, all tangled together. Without another word, she turned and yanked open the dorm door, letting a rush of warm air engulf her. She didn't look back, afraid of what she might see in his eyes. Pity, disappointment, or worst of all, love that she felt undeserving of. Upstairs in her room, Zoe was out, likely at another party. The faint hum of the heater underlined the emptiness of the space. Lila shrugged off her coat, letting it drop to the floor. She stood there in the dim lamplight, the Bible clutched against her. A wave of memories swept over her. Childhood Sundays, late-night prayers with Ethan. She sank onto her bed and unfolded the small slip of paper. The handwriting was Ethan's, careful and neat. Proverbs 3:6, he'll clear the path. Her breath caught. It was one of her favorite verses. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he shall direct your paths. The promise of divine guidance. She squeezed her eyes shut, feeling a deep ache in her chest. Was God still directing her path? She'd ignored so many calls, from friends and from home, as if avoiding them could dull her sense of guilt. Yet that guilt was still there, throbbing beneath her attempts at self-indulgence. Finally, she opened the Bible to the marked page. She tried to read, but the letters blurred. Tears slipped down her cheeks, and she was too exhausted to wipe them away. She set the Bible aside and curled onto her bed, hugging a pillow. In the quiet, she felt the darkness pressing in. She'd never felt so distant from God, or from who she used to be. Sometime after midnight, she drifted into a fitful sleep. She dreamt of her mother's hands, weathered from years of yard work and sewing, clasped in prayer. She saw those hands on her shoulder, heard her mother whisper softly, "Come home." The dream shifted to images of Grace Community Church, the oak tree behind it bare and skeletal in winter. Then Ethan appeared, looking at her with an expression that was equal parts love and sorrow. She tried to reach out, but he vanished like mist, leaving her alone in the pew. She woke with a start, breath ragged, tears dried on her cheeks. It was still dark outside. A street lamp cast shadows on the wall. For a moment, she thought she heard the echo of her mother's voice, but the dorm was silent, except for the hum of the heater. She pressed a hand to her chest, feeling the frantic thud of her heart. This can't go on, she thought, swallowing the dryness in her throat. She glanced at her phone, which displayed missed calls from Ethan and texts from her mother. She typed out a message. "I'm okay. Need time. Thanks for the Bible." But she couldn't bring herself to hit send. She set the phone aside again, a painful knot forming in her stomach. The next morning, her head pounded with a dull ache, and the stale taste of champagne lingered. Outside, the ground was dusted in fresh snow. Zoe stumbled in as Lila was getting dressed, murmuring something about having lost track of time. Lila offered a half-hearted wave, too drained to rehash the night. She went to class, but couldn't focus on the lecture. Ethan's presence in the city weighed on her mind. He came all this way. She pictured him finding that Bible in the church pew, carefully returning it, writing the note. Guilt fused with a budding warmth. Ethan had not condemned her. He'd simply shown up. By late afternoon, she found herself pacing near the entrance of her dorm, waiting, unsure if Ethan would come by again. The air bit her cheeks, and she exhaled in tense puffs. Her body felt heavy with regret, yet there was also a strange relief in admitting she couldn't keep avoiding him, or God. When Ethan finally approached, she almost bolted back inside. But she planted her feet. His expression held cautious hope. "Hey," he said, hands tucked in his coat pockets. "How are you feeling?" She swallowed hard, tears prickling at the corner of her eyes. "Not great," she admitted. "But I want to talk, if that's okay." Her voice trembled. He nodded, stepping closer. "I've got time." She glanced away, feeling raw, but mustered enough courage to meet his gaze. "I'm sorry I've been shutting you out. I don't know who I am right now." Ethan's eyes flickered with compassion. "You're Lila," he said gently, "and God isn't done with you. Neither am I." Snow drifted around them as a strained laugh escaped her. She wasn't certain how to bridge the chasm she'd created, but acknowledging it felt like the first step. She clutched the Bible she'd tucked into her jacket, feeling its weight against her heart. Maybe her path was buried under mistakes and regrets, but the promise in Proverbs echoed, "He'll clear the path." The next steps might be fragile, but she sensed that the real breaking point wasn't failure. It was the moment she finally decided to reach out for help. And with Ethan beside her, breath visible in the cold, she understood that even the iciest winter night could begin a thaw, one that led her back to the faith she'd once cradled so dearly. The winter days at college seemed shorter, yet every hour weighed on Lila Matthews. After her conversation with Ethan outside her dorm, she managed to meet him for coffee once more before he returned home. Their conversation was tentative, both of them gentle around the fresh wounds of her drift from faith. She sensed his patience, but also a quiet sadness. When he departed, pressing her grandmother's Bible into her hands again, she promised to call him soon. She meant it, but wasn't entirely sure she could keep it. In the weeks that followed, Lila tried to refocus. She studied harder, attended a few campus fellowship events, and read short passages from Proverbs late at night. Yet the lure of her newfound social life still glimmered in the background. Sometimes she managed to resist, choosing to stay in and pray or catch up on lectures. Other nights, she found herself giving in, riding the crest of a party's thumping music, laughing a bit too loudly at jokes that didn't really amuse her. Her roommate, Zoe, noticed Lila's wavering. "You're different lately," Zoe commented one afternoon, swirling pink paint on a poster for her next art show. "One minute, you're Miss Devout. The next, you're chugging spiked punch at some random get-together." She smirked. "Don't torture yourself. You can't serve two masters, right?" Lila flinched at the phrase, a direct echo of scriptural language. "I'm not torturing myself," she lied, voice tight. Zoe shrugged. "Well, you don't look particularly happy either." Lila couldn't deny it. She carried a persistent hollowness, like a mirror cracked from the inside. Even when she tried to piece the shards together, fellowship gatherings, or late-night philosophy sessions with her dorm mates, she felt the fractures. One evening, Zoe dragged Lila along to a small gallery show. It was hosted by an avant-garde poet named Adrian, a brooding figure known for his cynical verses about life and spirituality. Lila initially refused, but Zoe insisted it would be a chance to see something new. The gallery space was dimly lit, white walls hung with abstract art. Adrian recited a poem about an angel who'd lost its wings. His words pricked at Lila's conscience, the imagery unsettlingly familiar. He looked her way as he spoke of a God who abandoned his creation, and a shiver slid along her spine. They got to talking afterward, Adrian's dark eyes probing her mention of church. "You still believe in that?" he asked. "A cosmic father figure? Sounds like a convenient fairy tale." Zoe laughed lightly, sipping cheap wine from a plastic cup. "Don't start with her," she teased Adrian. "She's torn enough as it is." Flustered, Lila fumbled for an answer. She felt both defensive of her faith and oddly intrigued by Adrian's challenging questions. The conversation took on a late-night intimacy, discussing theology, existence, and how fear shaped people's need for religion. By the time the gallery closed, Adrian invited her for coffee, praising her refreshing honesty. Lila blushed, a confused blend of pride and guilt. It had been a while since anyone looked at her that intently. Over the next couple of weeks, she found herself drawn into Adrian's orbit. They exchanged messages about art, about old philosophers. He quoted Nietzsche and scoffed at the idea of prayer. Lila argued back, at first, but the more they talked, the more she doubted her own conviction. One cold afternoon, after wandering through a local bookstore, they ended up in Adrian's apartment. Surrounded by stacks of poetry collections and half-finished sketches, he pulled her into a kiss. It was startling, electric, and afterward, she felt strangely hollow, like something precious had slipped further out of reach. Word of her new thing, with the darkly captivating poet, spread among her social circle. Zoe was amused, a sly grin playing on her lips when she asked about it. Lila tried to ignore the gnawing ache in her chest. Adrian was intriguing, yes, but also unsettling. He'd mock her occasional references to God, dismiss them as naive. Yet he coaxed out her vulnerabilities, and a part of her found twisted comfort in being seen, even if it wasn't for who she truly was. Eventually, their brief affair ended almost as quickly as it began. One night, Lila arrived at Adrian's place to find him in a heated debate with a fellow poet. When she asked a question, trying to reconcile God's love with human suffering. He laughed scornfully. "It's all a delusion," he said. "Deep down, you know that too." She felt the final snap of disillusionment, like a cord cut with a sharp knife. She left in tears, stumbling down icy steps, cursing her own naivety. Zoe's earlier teasing echoed in her mind. "You can't serve two masters." She realized she'd pursued someone whose worldview was a direct assault on everything she once held sacred. Her fling had left her emptier than before. A few nights later, at a crowded house party, she noticed a mural on the wall. Angels with outstretched wings, their faces soft with compassion. Except the wings had been spray-painted over, with jagged graffiti. The jarring image struck a raw nerve. It felt like a metaphor for her own condition. The divine layered over by chaos, beauty marred by rebellious scribbles. Tears burned behind her eyes. She fled the party, weaving through confused onlookers. Outside, snow fell in thick clumps, muffling the city noise. Her phone, clenched in her fist, beckoned. She pressed Ethan's contact, desperate to hear his voice. The phone rang once, twice. Then she panicked and hung up. The fear that he'd ask questions she couldn't answer knotted her stomach. Instead, she sank onto a nearby bench, fingers trembling in the freezing air, and scrolled through old photos. Mission trips with the youth group, a bonfire night where Ethan's hand had lingered near hers, both of them too shy to admit the spark. She scrolled further, face damp with tears, until she landed on a snapshot from a church picnic. She was smiling wide, Ethan's arm around her shoulder, a summer sun lighting everything in gold. Looking at that image, she asked herself, when did I stop feeling holy? She sat there for what felt like hours, tears cooling on her cheeks. The party music throbbed faintly from within the building. Her heart hammered with an unfamiliar sense of desperation. She'd come to college craving freedom, yearning to explore, but all she'd found was a labyrinth of confusion and heartbreak. Where was the faith that once guided her? Eventually, she forced herself to her feet and trudged through the snow back to the dorm. Zoe was out. The room was quiet, lit only by the glow of a street lamp leaking through the curtains. Lila fished out her grandmother's Bible from the desk drawer, though her hands shook. She opened it to the underlined verses in Isaiah and Proverbs, scanning the promises she used to lean on. The words blurred. She exhaled unsteadily, a fragile prayer forming on her lips. "God," she whispered, voice wavering, "I don't know where to go from here. I'm lost. Please, help me." The silence of the room pressed in, but somewhere within it, she sensed a faint stirring, like the faintest echo of a familiar melody, calling her home. Curling onto her bed, she let the tears come. She thought of Ethan's patient eyes, of her mother's clasped hands in prayer. She remembered the sweet hush of Grace Community Church, the oak tree where she and Ethan once carved their names. The memory comforted her, reminding her that her broken reflection wasn't the final image of who she could be. Even so, she knew the journey forward would be hard. Shame, hurt, and spiritual confusion tangled within her. The fling with Adrian, the parties, the neon-lit distractions, none of it had filled the growing void. Now she had to confront the reality that she couldn't run forever. For the first time in months, she truly believed that grace might still be waiting for her, no matter how lost she felt. Clutching her phone, she typed a single message to Ethan. "I'm sorry I keep pulling away. I want to fix this. I just don't know how." She hit send, heart pounding. Then she pressed the Bible to her chest, letting the weight of it remind her of the faith she once held close. Outside, the snowfall continued in thick silence, a soft hush over the city's roar. In that hush, Lila felt a tentative hope flicker, fragile yet real, the first sign she might find her way back. The campus chapel stood at the far end of the quad, its stained glass windows glinting faintly in the dull winter sun. Lila Matthews had passed it many times, hurrying to class or heading to study groups, never daring to step inside. But today, something tugged her toward the heavy oak doors. Anxiety twisted in her stomach as she pushed one door open, bracing for judgment or a wave of guilty memories. Instead, she found quiet, a soft hush, empty pews illuminated by the gentle glow of colored light. She hesitated in the doorway, cross necklace cool against her skin. The place felt both foreign and achingly familiar. She slid into a pew near the front, hardly aware of her tear-stained cheeks or how her breath trembled. Unable to hold it in, she buried her face in her hands and wept. Grief for her mistakes, for the distance she'd placed between herself and God, and for the ache of missing the home she'd tried so hard to outgrow. Footsteps echoed behind her. She wiped her eyes, half expecting a campus security guard to ask why she was there after visiting hours. But when she glanced back, she saw Ethan. He wore a heavy coat, hair damp from melting snow, concern plain in his eyes. She couldn't form words. The last time they'd spoken was a late-night phone call where she'd mumbled apologies, claiming she wanted to fix things, though she'd barely believed it herself. Yet here he was, breath hitching in the chilly chapel air. He took a seat beside her, leaving a respectful space between them. "No lectures?" she asked softly, voice shaking with the residue of tears. Ethan shook his head. "I didn't come here to lecture. I got your text last night. Figured you might want someone to talk to." He paused, noticing her tear-streaked face. "Are you okay?" She shook her head, silent at first. Then the words spilled out. Regrets, confusion, the sting of realizing how far she'd strayed from her faith. She expected him to interrupt or offer Bible verses in a stern voice, but he simply listened, nodding now and then. She admitted how lonely she felt, even surrounded by new friends and late-night parties. How every attempt at filling the void only seemed to carve it deeper. When she finally ran out of words, she sighed, trembling. For a moment, Ethan said nothing. Then, quietly, he began to speak. "After Dad died," he said, voice unsteady, "I had my own crisis of faith. Couldn't see how God's love fit with losing him. I went through the motions for a while, showing up at church, quoting scripture, without feeling any of it. For months, I kept it to myself, scared to admit I was questioning everything I'd been taught." Lila's eyes flickered with recognition, sorrow mixing with relief. He understood. "But you never showed it," she whispered. "You always seemed so steady." A wry smile touched Ethan's lips. "I was good at hiding it, like you are." He let that sink in before continuing. "One night, Pastor Nichols told me faith isn't about never doubting. It's about trusting that God can handle our doubts. That stuck with me. I realized I wasn't locked in a cage. I was guided by something bigger than my questions." His voice softened. "I think that's what faith really is. A compass, not a prison." A tremor of hope coursed through Lila. She pressed her palm against her heart, where it beat irregularly beneath her ribs. "I feel like I've run so far, done so much I regret. Some days, I'm not even sure who I am." Ethan reached out, hesitated, then gently rested a hand on hers. "God's not done with your story. The real you is still in there. It always has been." She let out a shaky breath. She wanted to believe him. The hushed stillness of the chapel seemed to echo that promise. Outside, wind rattled the stained glass, casting muted blues and reds across the pews. It felt like a living metaphor. Fractured light forming something beautiful despite the pieces. They stayed that way for a long while, talking in low voices. It was different from their childhood chats. They spoke not just about scripture and how to interpret certain verses, but about depression, pain, and the way shame could cloak someone in secrecy. Lila found herself sharing stories she'd hidden even from Zoe, about the hollow feeling after nights out, the fleeting romance with Adrian that left her raw. Each time she braced for Ethan's reproach, but he offered only empathy. By the time they left the chapel, dusk had settled. A faint orange halo crowned the horizon. As they walked out, Lila noticed her reflection in the glass doors. Her mascara was smudged, eyes puffy. But she didn't look away this time. She acknowledged it all: the brokenness, the uncertainty, and the fragile seed of hope growing in her chest. In the days that followed, Ethan lingered on campus. He used some saved vacation days to stay in a spare room of a friend's apartment, just until Lila felt steadier. She wasn't sure if he was overextending himself, but she couldn't deny the relief of his presence. They met in the cafeteria after classes, sipping lukewarm coffee while discussing the day's ups and downs. Sometimes they visited the chapel together, reading passages from Isaiah. When Lila felt the old tide of shame threaten to pull her under, Ethan's calm voice reminded her, "Faith is about returning, not about having never left." One night, they found an empty study lounge. Lila confessed fears about returning to Grace Community Church. "What if everyone judges me for being gone so long?" She twisted the hem of her sweater nervously. Ethan smiled reassuringly. "I think you'll find more love than judgment. And if a few people do judge, that says more about them than it does about God." She nodded, fiddling with the cross necklace. That quiet conversation stretched into the small hours of the morning. They discussed everything from her roommate Zoe's skepticism to Ethan's own nightmares about losing his father. They didn't shy away from tears, laughter, or even long pauses. By the time they finally parted ways, Lila felt something shift inside her, like a wound in her soul had begun to mend. Slowly, a renewed faith took shape. Lila started small. She prayed each morning, even if her words stumbled. She read scripture during her lunch break, focusing on verses about restoration and mercy. She reached out to her mother with an honest phone call, admitting she'd struggled more than she'd let on. Her mother cried with relief, gently encouraging Lila to come home any time she was ready. Zoe observed these changes with both curiosity and a hint of scorn. "Back to being a church girl, huh?" she asked one weekend, eyeing the worn Bible on Lila's desk. Lila took a breath. "I never stopped believing. I just got lost for a while. But my faith doesn't mean I have all the answers. I'm just trying to do better." Zoe pursed her lips, arms folded. "Well, do what you need to do, but don't expect me to kneel in prayer or anything." To Lila's surprise, she felt no urge to argue or defend herself vehemently. She simply nodded. "I wouldn't force you, but if you ever want to talk, I'm here." That quiet confidence sparked a subtle shift in Zoe's expression. Though she shrugged it off, Lila noticed a flicker of respect. Maybe her friend wasn't ready to explore faith, but at least the conversation was open. As final exams ended, Lila decided it was time to visit Grace Community Church for a weekend service. Ethan headed back home a day early, and they planned to meet at the sanctuary on Sunday morning. Lila invited Zoe on a whim. "If you're curious, you can come along." To her amazement, Zoe said yes. Sunday dawned crisp and clear. The sky was a brilliant blue, the winter sun reflecting on patches of snow. Nervous energy pulsed through Lila as she approached the church's double doors. She spotted Ethan waiting by the entrance, hands in his coat pockets, a gentle smile on his face. Zoe stuck close behind Lila, arms crossed protectively over her jacket. Inside, warm air and familiar scents, polish and old hymnals, embraced them. A few heads turned, and Lila braced for disapproval. But most faces lit up at the sight of her. Mrs. Jenkins from the youth choir practically beamed, greeting both girls with a hug. Lila swallowed against the lump in her throat. It was a homecoming, imperfect perhaps, but a homecoming nonetheless. The service itself felt different than she remembered. She was more aware of her own brokenness, yet also more open to grace. Pastor Nichols spoke about second chances, quoting from Isaiah, "Though you are deep in trouble, I will be deeper still in rescue." The words resonated powerfully. She glanced at Zoe, who sat quietly, arms now resting in her lap. A trace of curiosity showed in her eyes. After the final hymn, Lila found herself at the front of the sanctuary, Ethan by her side. Though no grand altar call was happening, she felt a need to lay down her burdens in prayer. She whispered a silent apology for her missteps and a thank you for the guidance that led her here again. A gentle peace flickered inside her, a flame that might waver in the wind, but was a light nonetheless. When she turned, Ethan was looking at her, affection shining in his gaze. It wasn't a look of pity or confusion. It was understanding, trust, maybe even love. She reached for his hand, and he squeezed hers in return, their clasp as natural as breathing. In that moment, Lila understood. Returning to faith was not about erasing her past, but embracing grace that is stronger than any detour. Ethan's steady presence reminded her that she wasn't alone. She glimpsed Zoe hovering in the aisle, hands in her coat pockets, looking uncertain but not dismissive. Maybe, just maybe, there was room for all of them, broken, searching, questioning, to find hope in this place. For the first time in a long while, Lila felt genuinely free, not because she'd run away from her old life, but because she'd returned with a fuller understanding of what faith could be. It was a compass, not a cage, guiding her forward, scars and all, into a future illuminated by quiet, steadfast light.